My name is Kwame Owino. I work at the Institute of Economic Affairs. The Institute of Economic Affairs is a think tank. Our work is to carry out research on public affairs. I was asked to speak to you about Kenya's debt position and to say a few things here. The story I'm supposed to tell you is just to tell you a story about Kenya's debt in 6 charts. That's it. Okay, so let's start with what is public debt. Public debt comes from the accumulation of deficits. So every year the government of Kenya spends a ton of money. Often, most of that money is basically money that is collected from taxes every day. The government of Kenya collects taxes of 8 billion per day, spends 12 billion per day. And what that means is that 3 billion difference between 8 and the 12, or 11.8, is covered by borrowing. Some of it is usually on account of basically a grant here and there, but principally, it's covered by borrowing. So that's the first thing that you see. Before we go to the charts, I'll also want to tell you something. There are 201 members of the United Nations family. If you rank all the 201 members from the richest to the poorest, Kenya is the 46th poorest country in the world. We don't speak like we are, but we need to understand ourselves that. Kenya is the 46th poorest country in the world. It hurts some people's pride. It doesn't hurt mine anymore. The second thing is, if you line up countries by the amount of money they spend, Kenya has the 63rd largest budget for a country that is 45th poorest. But that's where the Kenya debt status in 6 charts comes in. So what you see in that chart is a tracing of the amount of money Kenya spends as a percentage of the gross domestic product. Now, the gross domestic product is an economist's way of saying how much value or how much work people do per year and what it is quantitative value in the shilling or whatever other currency. And the government of Kenya, as you can say there, every year over the last 5 years, basically last 5 years to 2025, from 2021 to 2025, spends about 24 of every 100 shillings that all Kenyans work for. For every 100 shillings of value created in Kenya, the government of Kenya's spending is equivalent to 25 shillings of it. Of which, of that 24, 18 is taxes, and therefore the 6 that makes up the 24 is borrowing. And that borrowing comes from domestic and external. So that's a trend, and it's very stable. You can tell it's fairly stable. The orange line at the top, the blue line that follows that orange line tells you that gap is the difference between what is borrowed and what is spent. So what is debt? That difference between how much the government collects in its revenues and what it spends is basically a deficit every year. Students of economics call it the fiscal deficit, which is that difference between how much money government collects in revenues and how much it spends. Debt is the pile-up of deficits over time. So that combination is what piles up, and it's called the debt stock. And that debt stock is what you saw in the clock that we started with. So that register is telling you how much. And as you saw, it's 29,000 shillings today per second. The government of Kenya spends a lot of money, but it spends more than it collects. Remember, the reason that's important, and I heard some of you say here that debt is not bad. I am not too sure anymore. When I was younger, I believed that. Why? It's usually, go back to Google and you start to trace when that phrase woke up in Kenya. It's around the time that we started to buy very shiny infrastructure projects. You guys have to raise 8 billion every day, and they spend 11. It is in their interest to tell you that debt is not bad. So we'll go to the second chart now. So what this small chart tells us here, the present value of debt to the gross domestic product, which is the present value of debt to how much value is created in a year. And the reason that's important is that value and that income is what is used to pay debt, because government collects it as revenues and uses that to pay for debt. So if you look at it, I told you that the debt is, when government borrows, it borrows from 2 sources. It could borrow internally through what they call treasury bonds, treasury bills and stuff, or it could borrow externally through something else that we are really boasting about now, which is Eurobonds and all those other bonds and whatever things. So some of the debt that exists, that part of that 29,000 shillings, which is accumulated additionally every second, is owed to foreigners. Some of it is owed to domestic people. What this chart here is telling us is the accumulation of debt over time. It's telling us how much debt stock, which is the total amount of debt over time. And as you can see, that starting in about 2020 and 21, domestic borrowing or external borrowing was higher. And if you put the two of them together, it leads to the total which you see in that straight line, which is the chart. So first, that straight line is really, really steep. It's quite steep. The gradient tells you, so what it's telling you is that the total accumulation of debt over the number of years we are considering here has been rather fast. And by the time we get to the 2025-27, which is the projected numbers by the government of Kenya, right, most of the debt would be owed internally, the orange bar. So the orange bar starts to dominate the blue bar from around 2022, 23, and then all the way up. But the point is, this is not to be clever with charts and stuff. It's just to tell you that Kenya's debt stock is growing, and the composition between debt owed internally and debt owed externally also changes. And what are the things that drive that? Part of the reason you saw in the last 2 years, the last two bars, basically, is external debt and internal debt have different risk profiles. Because when you owe foreigners, they're not taking it in Kenya shillings. They're taking it in dollars or whatever that currency is, right? So what that means is that Kenyan enterprises, because government does not trade, have to accumulate or have to sell something to somebody to acquire dollars, whatever it is, yuan, whatever currency that is, for government to be able to pay that debt when it falls due. So that's a first. Domestic debt has a different one. Domestic debt is basically about government taxing you and I, getting revenues for whatever ways, but getting revenues and all. And as you can see, in the last few years, the Kenya shilling has been really stable. And that stability means the amount of debt that is represented by dollars was more stable than the others. But government of Kenya continued to borrow, because if it couldn't borrow externally, what did it do? It borrowed internally. And that has driven that difference in profiles between debt, domestic and external debt. Most of these debt is owed to ourselves. Domestic debt has another danger. Why? Government can inflate it away. What do you mean by government inflating it? By printing cash. Simply asking the central bank, pay, or bring this and that. So it has its own profiles. And government usually has more command of domestic debt than external debt. Because external debt, I mean, it's not possible. Well, some people try, but it's not possible to print enough dollars to be able to pay people that debt. But domestically, especially if the political position is weak, many governments have tried to inflate domestic debt. Or government just repudiates it. Simply say, we won't pay. It's happened on this continent where governments say, look, we'll just take a haircut and stuff like that. And it happens. So remember, the debt question is also a political one, because political decisions are the ones that lead to, okay, why should we have debt in the first place? And I don't know who's in the house, and I know Kenyans are core nationalists. It's us around the world, and the world looks to be, yes, no wonder we think we are richer than the world, even if we are not. But the point is this: people think that external debt is worse. And many times when Kenyans talk about debt, they think external debt is the debt we owe to foreigners. I mean, right? Most of it is actually owed to ourselves. And any risks that obtain from holding large amounts of debt, right, are borne now by us and by foreigners. So I think that's an important contextual issue. But let's talk about the politics of it, because this is sovereign debt or national debt. So it's debt that is accumulated through political decisions and processes. And how did this debt get to be this big? We Kenyans like what? Spectacular things. So I, for instance, have had a problem with debt in Kenya for close to, well, I'd say about 9 or 10 years now. Well, even more. Kenyans like beautiful things built for them. Among those are the SGR. Who's reading on the SGR here? No, I won't shame you. It's a fantastic piece of, it's a fantastic piece of infrastructure. But the truth is, it's not paying for itself. And when it's not paying for itself, we divorce the fact that Kenyans have debt. So I hear Kenyans say very interesting things such as, why shouldn't the government do this? Well, it's provided as another stadium. It's called Talanta. Soon its name will change to a certain leader. It's building an expressway that we all love. We want an airport that looks like Ethiopia's or one that looks like Dubai and stuff like that. That's the stuff. So when government builds that stuff, this is the consequence, right? That's it. So we need to learn to connect the fact that the government of Kenya takes your taxes and mine, which is the credit card, and it swipes it for everything we want. And now it's swiping it for Nyota funds and all that stuff. So please connect, especially if you're Kenyan who has a payslip or has a business, please connect this debt to some of the stuff that government has bought. Of course, a few people say stuff such as, but it's also stolen. That's true. But often, they also spend on stuff that Kenyans really love. And so we are building a stadium that is worth $100 million. $100 million. Now, $100 million anyway is not small change. If you compare a 60,000-seater stadium to the UK, and let me just start with the UK because that's where everybody watches soccer, right? The entire UK has only 5 stadiums with a seating capacity of 60,000 people. The UK budget, I think, is 18 or 19 times bigger than Kenya's. Do you see that? Do you see that? So basically, this picture represents, in our view at the Institute of Economic Affairs, irresponsible spending. That's it. And I know there are theories out there that some of this debt is what people call odious debt. And you know what odious debt? Odious debt is debt that was not used for the purpose. Sorry. This picture represents political decisions. We have a parliament that allows the executive to hold a swiping credit card that you and I pay for, and every time the executive says we want to buy a stadium, parliament tells them, swipe it. We don't care. Just swipe it. They want a new plane for anybody else, they swipe it. So this is the result of a swipe and swipe and swipe card. I am one person who says there's no amount of money the government of Kenya can't spend. None. Let me tell you why. If you think about the numbers that are represented here by the government of Kenya's expenditure per day, you know Kenyans don't know this, by the way. The reason we think we are rich is because our government spends a lot of money. The government of Kenya, based on last year's declared budgets, spent more money in the year than Uganda, Tanzania, and Rwanda put together. So we have a government that is in love with spending and spending big. Okay, before I depress everybody and I have to leave here, let me go to the next. What this next picture, chart 3 shows us is debt as a percentage of GDP. And it's come from about 60 all the way, peaked at 70 in 2020 or thereabout, and then came down, right? That blue top line. And then the orange line is basically domestic debt. The two of them added together constitute the total, which is the total debt owed. And what we can see is that towards the end of last year, it would seem to you like debt was coming down, right? Because it went down by about 3 percentage points of GDP, of the value. And that looks like it's a nice thing. Actually, what happened is the Kenya shilling strengthened. So when the Kenya shilling strengthened, the quantum of debt that is owed to foreigners, right, stabilizes or goes down. But the government of Kenya continued to swipe by going back to domestic debt, right? And that's been borrowing and borrowing and borrowing. So that's what this picture is. One of the things that the government of Kenya does, in addition to accumulating debt, is paying it back. That's why people continue to lend it. And if you look at this again is a 10-year trace of how much government of Kenya spends. I started by telling you that for every 100 shillings of value created in Kenya every year, for every 100 shillings of value, the government of Kenya spends about 23 or 24 shillings, right? Which is 24%. Of which 17 usually is taxes that's collected, and then the rest is filled up by borrowing. And it's that accumulation of borrowing that leads to the debt stock. Let's ask ourselves, of the share of taxes that it collects, how much of it is dedicated to borrowing every year? The reason that is important is for us to be able to tell ourselves, what does this mean? What does this mean for the pressure, the financial pressure that the government itself is under? So as you see here, again, the purple line, which is an addition of all those numbers, you can see that it came from about, let me check this properly. I just want to make sure I read the last one. 54 to about 66, right? So it's telling you that for every one of those 8 billion shillings the government collects in a day, right, 64% of that is just paying debt. So principally what it's telling you that the government of Kenya's main service provision is what? Paying debt, not teaching kids or curing you and I when we get unwell. And the reason this is important is not just for us to throw numbers at each other. The reason this is important, remember, I know when we are idle students of economics and we explain ourselves poorly, people say, okay, so why are you just giving us these numbers? Look, those numbers show up in the fact that we have schools in the city, right, that have had to install triple deckers. Yes, because school capacity is so behind the demand. Why? Because government has to pay debt. That's one. Two, the government of Kenya historically is the largest employer of teachers in sub-Saharan Africa, outside South Africa and Nigeria, right? Because the teaching service is the biggest. So that's one. But remember this year, the government of Kenya, actually, as the chart shows you, the government of Kenya spends more money paying debt than educating kids and providing health services. Those numbers are connected to that card being swiped in advance. Do you guys see that? If you live with anything else, please remember that the debt is not something that grew out of the air. It grew out of the fact that there's a shopping list for expenditure and the public sector swipes for every single thing. And it's swiping it at a rate that's faster than both our economic growth and the rate at which revenues are being collected. So that's what that picture shows. And I wanted to end with the last one, which was basically, as I was preparing this at about 3:30, so this was what a snapshot of what the debt position was, which is 12.3 trillion. You know, Kenya is made up of those small nations, we call them, right? Or whatever you call them, right? In my mother tongue, and we were literate people, I think, we don't have a word for trillion. After a million, we say you count and count and count until your jaw breaks, right? Here it is, the jaw breaker, which represents how much money the government of Kenya owes. 12.3 trillion at that time, of which 6.7 trillion, and now Kenyans don't remember, a million is 10 to power 6, right? 6 zeros after it. A billion is 10 and 9. A trillion is therefore 10 and what? 12 zeros after it. So that's your 6 trillion owed domestically and 5 trillion owed externally. So here it is. Now, why are these numbers important? Numbers are important because if you owe that amount of money, right, it means Kenya's economic policy choices for the next generation, I'd lie to you not, 15 years at least, right, will be framed against what government can pay for. And right now, what is it paying for? It's paying debt. That's a first. Secondly, I'd be remiss if I did not talk about the generational protests that we had last year and the year before. Our trace is not that it was about the IMF or anything else. When a government faces this kind of pressure, where you have to pay that amount of money by the day, you're under pressure to do two things. What are you going to do? You either borrow more or raise your taxes. You raise taxes and reduce what? The quantum of public services. That was it. So I still maintain, fine, there are all manner of theories about what happened and who incited who. I still maintain that that response was a response to the economic shock that we placed on young people and families by virtue of the fact that government was raising taxes and reducing public service delivery. Thank you very much, guys.